Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. You may see a pile of books by me. That is because after my last video on 10 of my literary unfavourites, I had a goodly number of people ask, could I share with you 10 of my more favourite classic books? And so that is exactly what we're going to do in this video. And without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? What I'd like to say just before we start is that in no way is this video saying that these are the 10 most definitive classics, even in my opinion, but they are 10 classics that I really love. You'll notice there's an absence of plenty on here, and I could easily make a number of other videos like this, but I just thought I'd give you a broad selection of books that I actually do enjoy. So, starting in first place, and in no particular order, is Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. Have you read it? What a book. I mean, we're coming in at a stonking 1,000 pages, approximately, in reasonable sized type. This one's about 850 pages, but the type's quite small. In this book, you are following the story of Edmond Dantes, who comes back on a ship to Marseille, I think it is, and he's going to get married to the beautiful Mercedes when on his wedding day he is arrested for a crime that he didn't commit, and he's sent to the the worrisome Chateau d'If prison island, where he meets an old man who teaches him all sorts of things, including mathematics, philosophy, and where there is buried treasure. He has to work out his great escape, but the story is not so much the escape as how Edmond Dantes reinvents himself after all these years confined and brings himself into society as the Count of Monte Cristo, one of the most mesmerizing characters to ever walk the pages of a book. He absolutely captures people in his thrall. He meets up with people who he once knew, who have grown through their life and forgotten him, and they may have grown in governments, they are in the bureaucracy, they could be in the police service, some of them become extraordinarily wealthy. And this book takes you across good sections of Europe as the story unfolds. You have so many ripe characters in this book, but it's the whole demeanour of Edmond Dantes, the Count of Monte Cristo, which absolutely captivates you. And how will you feel about Edmond Dantes at the end of this book? Because it most certainly is vengeful. He wants to find out who was responsible for putting him in prison and wreaking a terrible revenge on all who he thinks has wronged him. So that's the Count of Monte Cristo. If you've never read it, oh my days, it is an absolutely scintillating read. It may be big. There is a chunk right in the middle, about this big, which is pretty dull to get through, but it's necessary to swap over the story, sort of a continuation, because so many years go missing. So a really good book. In this video, I'm just going to give you a little excerpt from each book so that you can get a sense for the writing, as it were. So here's an excerpt from The Count of Monte Cristo. I too, as happens to every man once in his life, have been taken by Satan into the highest mountain in the earth. And when there he showed me all the kingdoms of the world, and as he said before, so said he to me, Child of earth, what wouldst thou have to make thee adore me? I reflected long, for a gnawing ambition had long preyed upon me. And then I replied, Listen, I have always heard of Providence, and yet I have never seen him or anything that resembles him, or which can make me believe that he exists. I wish to be Providence myself, for I feel that the most beautiful, noblest, most sublime thing in the world is to recompense and punish. Satan bowed his head and groaned. You mistake, he said. Providence does exist, only you have never seen him because the child of God is as invisible as the parent. You have seen nothing that resembles him because he works by secret springs and moves by hidden ways. All I can do for you is to make you one of the agents of that providence. Second on my list of classics I absolutely love is actually one which may come close to ranking as my favourite classic of all time, and that is Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Oh my days, what a book. Now, as you may have watched me before, I don't always recommend the books that I love. I would recommend this to people, but with a few caveats. It depends what kind of book you're looking for. This book is psychological. It's philosophical. It's slow. It demands a lot of attention, and I would really recommend that if you read this book, you read it with a pencil and take notes as you go and think and leave your thoughts on the page and argue with Raskolnikov, who is the main character, because it will cause you to open up your ability to perceive and understand the world and people's beliefs. Raskolnikov, as is talked about here, there is a crime, and then there's the so-called punishment. It's more a stepping over of society's boundaries. What constitutes moral correctness? You see, there's an idea back in the day when Dostoevsky is writing this of the Übermensch, of the Superman, someone who can, if they're doing it for the greater good and they are of a certain character and disposition, they can actually cross the bounds of what society says is right and wrong. And it's not criminal in their case. It's not actually wrong. Raskolnikov holds Napoleon up as an example. And I'll read you a quote about that in a moment. But Raskolnikov commits a crime and then has to deal with the fallout of that crime. This is a book that traces guilt and conscience through you, because someone is searching for the perpetrator of the crime. What's his name? I can't remember his name now. The investigator begins with P. He's looking into the crime, and of course Raskolnikov is called in a few times because he was in the area, and you see how it really drives in crackers the tension of being hunted, as it were, but also trying to philosophically justify yourself, because what he does, he believes isn't wrong, or at least theoretically he doesn't. And there are a bunch of other characters who are very significant. I'm not going to say no more about this. If you read the book, you can watch my in-depth review on Crime and Punishment, which is years old, but it goes into some of the characters. Prepare for a slow read, but one that really gets the cogs of your mind grinding. So that was the second one, Crime and Punishment. Let me just read you a snippet. It was like this. I asked myself one day this question. What if Napoleon, for instance, had happened to be in my place, and if he had not had Toulon, nor Egypt, nor the passage of Mont Blanc to begin his career with, but instead of all those picturesque monumental things, there had simply been some ridiculous old hag, a pawnbroker, who had to be murdered to get money from her trunk for his career, you understand. Well, would he have brought himself to that if there had been no other means? Wouldn't he have felt a pang at its being so far from monumental and sinful too? The third book on our list is an absolute humdinger, and it's another one which I wouldn't recommend to you unless I knew what your reading tastes were or what your reading ambitions were. And it is none other than Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which we recently read in my Patreon community, and we had a group meeting to discuss it, which went on for like 3-4 hours. And the diversity of opinions and sentiments expressed over this book is truly remarkable. This is a book that is furious in its approach. It brims with mystifying power, which even Emily Bronte seemed to lose control of. Now, it is Gothic in many respects. It has the Gothic elements. It has elements of romance in it as well, but not like you would imagine. Some will call it a love story, others will call it a hate story, because how do you even pin this book down? You have Cathy and Heathcliff. Heathcliff is an outsider who's brought in when he's a little street urchin into the family of a respectable family. He and Cathy form this unusual, almost transcendental, bordering on the quantum mechanical attachment to each other, where they are almost the same soul but in two beings, and their love and passion for each other is absolutely destructive. It destroys one another, it destroys everything around them. It's a pure maelstrom of the darkest feelings. Now, this book shows the frustration of plans. It shows the injury that can be caused because of your upbringing, the injury that can be caused because of societal expectations, the injury that can be caused because of your expectation from others who have buckled to society's standards. This book features a lot of hard reading, and by hard I don't mean hard words, but grueling passages. There's unkind treatment, brutal treatment of younger ones in this, and of people that you supposedly should love. There's a lot of cruelty in this book. But this is one of the best Byronic heroes ever. A Byronic hero is almost an anti-hero. He's a hero who is quite sullen, negative, even violent, but you can't help but be drawn to, which is what Heathcliff is. Why is he so mesmerising? The passion that this raises to is off the scale. It's off the charts. And I understand why so many people love it. I understand why loads of teenagers love it as well. Also why loads of teenagers hate it at school, because sometimes if you don't know what's coming, it's hard to know how to even understand the book. It is fantastic. All set on the Yorkshire moors, windswept. Oh, just so brilliant. I can't really tell you enough about this book. But it's one of those, I don't know if to recommend it to you personally or not, but I think it is a wonderful piece of work and only improves every time you read it, as our recent run through Patreon demonstrated. So that's the next one, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. In my opinion, the most forceful of all the Bronte sisters and all of the books. I'll read you a little snippet. I could scarcely refrain from smiling at this antipathy to the poor fellow, who was a well-made athletic youth, good-looking in features and stout and healthy, but attired in garments befitting his daily occupations of working on the farm and lounging among the moors after rabbits and game. Still, I thought I could detect in his physiognomy a mind owning better qualities than his father ever possessed. Good things lost amid a wilderness of weeds, to be sure, whose rankness far overtopped their neglected growth. Yet notwithstanding, evidence of a wealthy soil that might yield luxuriant crops under other and favourable circumstances. The fourth book on the list you will probably never have guessed was coming, because you probably think of this as being not as sophisticated as other books, but I wanted to put it in for a very particular reason. Reading is about enjoyment. It is about fancy and whimsy and escapism. It is about learning. It is about seeing into ourselves and into the lives of others. But even the simplest of stories can reveal a lot about yourself and find the pure wonder of being alive, and nothing better in life than childhood. And so the next book is Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. I recommend, if you've never read Peter Pan, to read it even as an adult. And if you can, get the Robert Ingpen illustrated version. This was a centenary edition. Peter Pan, you probably know the story from the films. You know, you've got Wendy and her brothers, Michael is one of them, isn't it? And Peter comes through the window one night and is chasing Tinkerbell, who's stolen his shadow, and all that kind of stuff, if I remember that bit rightly. And they end up going away to Neverland, which is generated from the playfulness of children's minds. They go to Neverland, they meet, you know, the great Captain Hook and Smee and the crocodile and the Tiger Lily and Tinkerbell and the Lost Boys and everybody else. What a beautiful flight of fancy this book is. Not many books come close to capturing childish imagination, which we as adults never lose. And if you have, you owe it to yourself to read Peter Pan. Lots of people who want to get into the classics say, could you lend me a book from my library, which is how most of my books go missing. I will often pick this book and they turn their nose up at it, sneer at it as if to say it's a children's book. Well, technically, yes, but what a brilliantly written book. I'm going to read you a snippet now. I just want to explain to you that he comes up with this idea at the beginning that when children go to bed at night, mother comes in and she sorts out the mess in their heads like she tidies out the linen in the drawer, so that the next day the children can be happy and not all ruffled up in their imaginations. It's just such a beautiful, potion of childish adventure, childish spirit of adventure and awe and wonderment at the world that we inhabit, which we owe ourselves to keep. So I'll just read you this little clip about when Mrs. Darling, that's Mum, is sorting out their minds and how she first learns about Peter Pan. This is just charming. Occasionally in her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found things she could not understand, and of these, quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds, while Wendy's began to be scrawled all over with him. The name stood out in bolder letters than any of the other words, and as Mrs. Darling gazed, she felt that it had an oddly cocky appearance. The fifth classic work up should not come as any surprise. It is a play of Shakespeare's, and the one I've chosen for this video is Hamlet. It may be my favourite Shakespeare, but my mood changes so often with that, and he does so many good ones, it's hard to place a favourite. But Hamlet is an inspired piece of genius. The story of Hamlet, you may have studied at school or you may have not. Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, and we start off with him talking to his friends who have seen a ghost walking about in the castle grounds. And the ghost ends up talking to Hamlet when he stays to watch it, because the ghost looks just like his deceased father, recently deceased. The ghost tells Hamlet that he had actually been murdered by his own brother, so Hamlet's uncle, who had then gone on to marry the former king's wife. Now Hamlet has to deal with this knowledge and has to work out what he's going to do. Will he revenge his father, or will he just let his days slip by? He's tormented by it because part of him is indignant, obviously, at the fact that the king, his father, was killed, and at the grossness that his brother would commit such a fratricide, as well as then sully his mother, and that his mother would go along with it. So he wants revenge, but at the same time, he finds himself indecisive. And that's the great hamasha of Hamlet. He is so indecisive. He doesn't just take action. But the way he goes about building up through the play to the point where he will take action, and who inspires him, and how he comes to find things out and work things out, and the mistakes that are made that cripple everybody in the play and bring down the fall of most of the cast. All of this is what feeds into this tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. But it is done with the most brilliant language, the most elevated language, more intricate than much of Shakespeare's previous stuff. You know, he's really hitting his form at Hamlet. It's probably his peak here in King Lear, Macbeth. And the way Shakespeare tussles with the human condition, which we all recognise, such as indecision, such as the role of honour and of nobility and of doing what is right, is just immense. And the way Hamlet puts words to these things. He's not the most likeable of Shakespeare's characters by a long shot, but he's arguably the deepest. And this pays you. If you take the time to read through this, this pays you so much. To take the time to understand what's being said and then ride on the rhythm, on the meter, on the lyricism, on the elevated thought and insights into life that Shakespeare managed to capture in this play. I will read you just one short snippet of it. And this short snippet, by the way, comes from the famous soliloquy To Be or Not to Be, but I'm not going to read that bit. This comes later on, much further down at the end. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is cickled o'er with the pale cast of thought. And enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard, their currents turn away and lose the name of action. No one speaks like that. No one's done better than that. The sixth book in our list is one that many of you who have subscribed to me recently after seeing the Where to Start with Classics, I'm going to bring it up again. It is Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I really need to address something here. Several commenters said about that being in the Where to Start with the Classics that you shouldn't be telling people to start with children's book. It is not a children's book. If you think that, you've probably either not read it and are going by movies, or you've read an abridged version or an altered version for children. This book was an argument by Daniel Defoe for the power of the individual. At a time when that was important. Some wanted a collectivist mindset, others focused on an individualist mindset separate from the state's control. That's part of what's being argued about in here. Robinson Crusoe is sold into slavery. I don't know if you know that. He becomes a wealthy plantation owner and himself becomes a slaver. But then he's washed up on an island where he's kept for over 20 years isolated, and he has to adapt to his surroundings. You know, it's nearly pure narration. There's not much talking in this because most of the time he's on his own. But that talking is him explaining everything to us, his inner thoughts, as he is left to vie against nature, to survive, to learn skills which he's never had in order to just keep on going. And then, of course, there's the big shock, which I was told off about revealing by someone in the last video, which is fair enough, but I thought everyone knew that shocker. And yes, how things change and what eventually happens to him so that he was able to get home and tell his story so that we could read it. This book is inspiring. It causes you to think deeply about the meaning of life. You know, he talks quite a lot about God because, of course, Daniel Defoe was religious himself, coming from sort of a Presbyterian direction. But his observations are so good. And the description of the island and the descriptions of the successes, the failures, what truly elevates you, what really, really is what matters in your life is in this book and should give you a lot of pause for thought. If you've never read Robinson Crusoe, do yourself a favour, go and get the actual one by Daniel Defoe, not a kid's version, and read his works. It is immense. To think this was written in, what, 1712, was it? As early as that, called the first novel in the English language, is just brilliant. Now, one of the ideas that's being observed in this book, I'm going to read this excerpt of right now. It comes at the beginning, and it is from Robinson Crusoe's father, giving him some advice after Crusoe says he wants to go to sea, whereas his father just wants him to get educated and, you know, live a decent life like his father has. It says, "He told me it was for men of desperate fortunes on the one hand, or of aspiring superior fortune on the other, who went abroad upon adventures, to rise by enterprise and make themselves famous in undertakings of a nature out of the common road. That these things were either too far above me or too far below me. That mine was the middle state, or what might be called the upper station of low life, which he had found by long experience was the best state in the world, the most suited to human happiness, not exposed to the miseries and hardships, the labour and sufferings of the mechanic part of mankind, and not embarrassed with the pride, luxury, ambition, and envy of the upper part of mankind. He told me I might judge of the happiness of this state by this one thing, viz., that this was the state of life which all other people envied, that kings have frequently lamented the miserable consequences of being born to great things, and wished they had been placed in the middle of the two extremes, between the mean and the great. That the wise man gave his testimony to this as the just standard of true felicity when he prayed to have neither poverty or riches." The seventh of the classics that I absolutely adore on this list is one that if you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you will know what is coming. It's not so well known, but I'm really pushing for people to know it. And this is a book I would just recommend someone reads. It is a short book of about 110 pages, and it is called A Month in the Country, and it's by J.L. Carr. This just falls in what I class as a classic. There's a different video on where I get my idea of a classic from. Written in 1980, this was. Now, the story, is just a prime example of form in writing. The structure is beautiful. When you step back and suddenly see the symmetry of this book, it's quite pleasing and breathtaking. It has one of my favourite endings to a book. Actually, what the book ends with is so innocuous, but you could not have found a better way to close the book out. The book itself follows our protagonist, Birkin, who is a young man who's just come back from the First World War. He's a little bit shook up, shell shock. And he is asked to go to this out-of-the-way little village up north in England, where someone has paid for him to reveal an old fresco in their ancient church. The church isn't anything too big, but it's got a long history back to the Norman days, and it's been plastered over. The fresco's been plastered over, and he has to restore it. He has to peel the plaster off and reveal and restore the colours up there. Now, as he does so, in this quiet little church with its little churchyard and graveyard outside, he starts thinking about the amazing effort the painter of the original fresco put in. He sees details in the fresco that makes him think, that's very particular. This man that's drawn here, the painter knew. Who was he? And then why is there a sudden change in the style of the painting over here? It's just it's just the most beautifully pleasing book on how wonderful life is if you just look at it. When he's mixing paints or talking about the kind of colours that are used, it's just so soul restoring because you realise the beauty in the most mundane things. Now, simultaneously to this, just outside the church, there's another character who's come back from the war called Moon. That's his surname. He is looking for, apparently, a buried knight. And he's looking for that. But at the moment, he's found a Roman settlement. And the two of them just get talking to each other. Now, Birkin gets drawn into the little goings-on of the village, but not in a massive, distracted way, but in a way that helps you just appreciate that we all live in this specific moment. That right now is a blessed thing if only we would stop and hold it and look at it, inhale it, taste it, shake it by our ears, run it across our cheek and our mouth to feel every texture in our moment of life. And that's why the end of this book is so good. It's just so good. There's hardly a book that finishes as well as this. So I'll just read you a little snippet, shall I? She walked out into the clearing with me and paused by a bush of roses rampaging onto the gravel. Sarah Van Fleet, she said. It was a pink rose, a single. It's an old variety, mind. It has sharp thorns, and it keeps on blooming. You'll see, there'll be some right into autumn. She smiled. Even if you don't visit us again, you'll know. I usually wear one in my hat. Here, take one. Later in the day, when I had to turn down Moon's suggestion that we go up to the pub, I remembered why I'd visited the vicarage. But as a matter of fact, Mossop turned up next day with an envelope containing an instalment, a couple of crumpled pound notes and a receipt for me to sign. That rose, Sarah Van Fleet. I still have it, pressed in a book. My Bannister Fletcher, as a matter of fact. Someday, after a sale, a stranger will find it there and wonder why. The 8th classic on our list is a book that I really don't think gets talked about enough. It's an absolute peach of a book, but it's not the easiest amongst this author's oeuvre, But nonetheless, I find it so satisfying and thought-provoking, and it pushes you, and it's very different to her other works, and it is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. Mansfield Park, to me, is a glorious piece of work. It's so different to Austen because there's a certain annoyance, a certain anger underneath the biting satire here. Whereas normally Austen keeps that hidden and concealed. She can tease, she can rebuke, she can jibe at society and its dispositions. But this one really has a go at the morals of her day. And that is a sore point. That is something that is much more serious. And so you sense more of a leaden weight within Mansfield Park compared to most of the others. And I absolutely love it. Is it my favourite Austen? I don't know. But it's certainly a classic that I absolutely love. It's so satisfying. So it follows the story of Fanny Price. She's not that well-to-do, but she moves in with her aunt and uncle who are well-to-do. Is it the Bertrams, I think, is their name. And amongst their children, they're taught by the mother that, you must never be on equal footing with Fanny because she is lesser than you. And so 3 of the 4, they don't treat her that well. They're quite dismissive of her. The girls particularly are quite awful to her. One of the 4 of her cousins, Edmund, he is lovely to her, and he has a lovely disposition. He's fair-minded, he's actually quite stoical, he's quite strong of character, although I wouldn't necessarily say he's charismatic. But he is a strong character. He has a strong feeling of right and wrong, as does Fanny Price. She is strongly conscious of what is morally, ethically right and wrong, both in the personal and private life and in conduct towards one another. However, onto the scene come the Crawfords, a brother and sister who they love living it up, they love the high life, they love having fun. This is an element that Austen brings into a lot of her works, is laughter and its place in society. And the 2 girls, the cousins, they fall for the brother. And Fanny's a bit disappointed when Edmund begins to fall for the sister. And then we see the outworking of it all. The clash of ideas, the love triangles, the honesty with yourself when you like somebody, but you have question marks about their own ways of going on. All of that comes into this book. It's very fascinating into the thinking of younger ones back then, in their 20s, for instance, late teens, 20s. How people enjoyed themselves, what was expected of you. But the biggest question Austen is asking is, what is right and wrong? Or what is the most noble person? What kind of person ought we to be? That's the question that she's asking fully, and is what Fanny ends up trying to help us answer. You'll have to read it to know any more. Jane Austen's mother didn't like this book, but Jane Austen herself put a lot into this because she had turned a corner to listen to a lot of public criticism that was going on, not to her, but of the conduct of people in the upper classes. And this book was a response because Austen had listened to a previous group of people that she had sort of held as insignificant and started listening to their arguments rather than judging just where they came from, and began to think they've got a point. And she put it into this book. I'll read you a quote. "An affection so amiable was advancing each in the opinion of all who had hearts to value anything good. Henry Crawford was as much struck with it as any. He honoured the warm-hearted, blunt fondness of the young sailor, which had led him to say, with his hand stretched towards Fanny's head, 'Do you know, I begin to like that queer fashion already, though when I first heard of such things being done in England, I could not believe it. And when Mrs. Brown and the other women at the commissioners at Gibraltar appeared in the same trim, I thought they were mad. But Fanny can reconcile me to anything,' and saw, with lively admiration, the glow of Fanny's cheek, the brightness of her eye, the deep interest, the absorbed attention, while her brother was describing any of the imminent hazards or terrific scenes which such a period at sea must supply." The 9th classic that I absolutely adore that is on this list comes from an author of whom I could have picked a great swathe of books that they've written. If I ever do another one of these videos, I'm sure this author will appear again, and that author is P.G. Wodehouse. Now, the one I have particularly gone for is The Code of the Woosters, which is the third Jeeves and Wooster novel that P.G. Wodehouse wrote. I was going to pick Joy in the Morning, which I absolutely love, which is another Wooster novel, but that's fallen apart through overreading. So I've picked Code of the Woosters. Now, Jeeves and Wooster, if you don't know, it's the typical English upper-class toff buffoon set in a world which isn't actually real. It is England that it's set in, but it's an England which P.G. Wodehouse captured, which so many people around the world think of the English gentleman like this because of P.G. Wodehouse's influence. In fact, P.G. Wodehouse was even more popular in America than in Britain, and he was, you know, almost the god over here as well. So, The Code of the Woosters, you, you have Bertie Wooster. He is called by his aunt Dahlia, or Dahlia, to go on a mission for her. Now, his aunts are always the bane of his life. They're always making him do stuff, and he can't resist them. And she wants him to get hold of a particular cow creamer, a silver cow creamer, because apparently Aunt Dahlia's husband wants it. But someone else is also after it, and that's Sir Watkin Bassett, who's a bit of a bounder of the First Order. And when Wooster goes into the place to buy this cow creamer, so does Watkin Bassett, and due to an accident, it looks like, because he trips over, Bert is trying to escape with the cow creamer without paying, so he looks like a thief. And Watkin Bassett, with his man Roderick Spode, who is none other than sort of a Mussolini imitation, grabs hold of him and tries to arrest him. And Watkin Bassett buys the creamer, and Aunt Dahlia, not happy with this, says, "You've got to go to his house now, and you've got to steal it." Well, of course, it's all this thing of capers and cross wires and high jinks, and it's all very contrived, but the genius of it is the way Wodehouse writes a sentence has you in tears with laughter. Bertie Wooster just is a first-person narration, and the way he talks, you know, you love him, but he's constantly getting himself into a muddle, normally through the machinations of other people. Throw into the mix a love triangle or a cross wires on love, and people breaking up, and then Wooster being the one that has to step in to be engaged because it's just the right thing to do, even though he doesn't want to marry the girl. All of this comes up with so many beautiful set-piece scenes of hilarity, and with the stupendously named characters that he always comes up with, like Roderick Spode, like Stiffy Bing, the girl that's in this, and then who is Gussie Fink Nottle is another one of his. If you've never read Wodehouse, read it. If you want to know where to start, try Code of the Woosters. Joy in the Morning is also a good one as well. I'll just read you an excerpt of this so you can get a flavour of the writing, because boy oh boy does he know how to write. Okay, this is Bertie Wooster talking to you, the reader. I don't know if you have had the same experience, but a thing I have found in life is that from time to time, as you jog along, there occur moments which you're able to recognise immediately with the naked eye as high spots. Something tells you that they're going to remain etched, if etched is the right word I want, forever on the memory, and will come back to you at intervals down the years as you are dropping off to sleep, banishing that drowsy feeling and causing you to leap on the pillow like a gaffed salmon. One of these well-remembered moments in my own case was the time at my first private school when I sneaked down to the headmaster's study at dead of night, my spies having informed me that he kept a tin of biscuits in the cupboard under the bookshelf. To discover, after I was well inside and a modest and unobtrusive withdrawal impossible, that the old bounder was seated at his desk and, by what I have always thought a rather odd coincidence, actually engaged in the composition of my end-of-term report, which subsequently turned out to stinker. One thing I'll say about Bertie Wooster, whenever you read him in your head, you can never make him sound like he does in your head when it comes out. Some people just about get away with it. I'm thinking of ones like Richard Briers and Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry, but even then they don't quite get it for me. The 10th book that I absolutely love on this list is a far more serious work. We're going back to some of the serious stuff again. And it's by an author that you just, again, around the booktube community, you do not hear much about this author at all. And it's Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim. Tuan Jim, as he's called in here. So Jim, he has high ideals of his own, or expectations of his own ability, his own importance. And I don't necessarily mean in a fully arrogant and egotistical way, but he feels that he's a person who can command, who is set to do great things. Early in the book, we see him take this dive off a ship where he's training as a sea cadet to save another lad who had fallen in. And without thinking, he just threw himself into jeopardy to save this lad. It gave him quite a reputation, and it lived up to his own idea of the kind of person he was. A little bit of a hero in his own mind. Later on, he is at sea, and he's on a ship heading, if I remember rightly, in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba. But there's a lot of Muslim pilgrims on the ship as well, heading to Mecca. When the ship, in the middle of the night, grinds against something, and it disturbs everybody, but they all go back to sleep again. And then a couple of the crew and the captain say to him, the ship's going to sink. But there's not enough lifeboats. Well, Jim wants to wake everybody up and tell them, but they say don't do that because all of the lifeboats will be swamped. Now they start to lower the escape ships, the rafts, into the water, and he can also see a storm coming in, so it's going to be submerged, this ship. And Jim has to make a decision whether he will stay on board with everybody, nobly and heroically, or whether he'll make a jump for it. And he makes a jump for it. The whole book is the fallout psychologically on Jim. It's remarkable. Now, it's not told from Jim's perspective. It's told from Marlowe. Marlowe is the narrator that Conrad uses in 3 books, the most famous of those being Heart of Darkness. That's narrated by Marlowe as well. The other one being Victory, another great book. But Lord Jim, it's just this understanding and sense of isolation, of solitude that Jim has because he's failed in his past. He's failed in his image of who he is. Now, he later sets up on an island where he is actually really revered by others. But before that, there's loads of stuff that we find him going through and conversations with Marlowe. It is such a slow book. It moves as fast as you could in the great heats of the Southeast Asian tropics at the height of summer. You know, languid days, heavy rains, just stultifying air. The book moves at a pace like that. You almost sweat while you're reading it, not because of tension, just because of atmosphere. Conrad has a beautiful way of describing things. When he talks about the sea in the background looking like a steel wall. You know what he means, don't you? If you've ever seen the sea between like a distant 2 points, obviously it's not flat, it stands up on the horizon and it's sort of that steel grey colour. That stuck with me for some reason. I just thought it was a beautiful example. It's the way Jim has to face the court commission as well, investigating what happened on that boat. And so on and so forth, the story goes. Has a very unusual ending, very gratifying, but like a lot of Conrad's works, when you get to the end, you're still not quite sure how to interpret it, you know? It's a very inward-looking book. And not many authors focus on solitude as their main story. But if you were to sum Conrad up, solitude is it. Whether you're solitary, even amongst a myriad of other people, or you are actually in a solitary situation, that's what Conrad's about. And Conrad had an extraordinary life at sea. He was Belgian, he wrote in English as his 3rd language. And that makes it, he was very literary in the way he writes. And I highly recommend anyone that wants to push their reading. If you were to talk about so-called harder books or intermediate books, Joseph Conrad would definitely be amongst those. And Lord Jim, it's high time I revisit this, actually. It's not his most famous. Like I say, Heart of Darkness is. Nostromo, arguably the best. Lord Jim has just got something, though. Something about it that captivates. And I can't put my finger on it. So there you go. That's the 10th one. I'll just read you a snippet. We return to face our superiors, our kindred, our friends, those whom we obey and those whom we love. But even they who have neither, the most free, lonely, irresponsible and bereft of ties, even those for whom home holds no dear face, no familiar voice, even they have to meet the spirit that dwells within the land, under its sky, in its air, in its valleys and on its rises, in its fields, in its waters and its trees, a mute friend, judge and inspirer. Say what you like, to get its joy, to breathe its peace, to face its truth, one must return with a clear consciousness. All this may seem to you sheer sentimentalism, and indeed very few of us have the will or the capacity to look consciously under the surface of familiar emotions. Well, I hope you've enjoyed going through this list with me of 10 classic books that I particularly enjoy. Like I say, I wouldn't recommend them to everybody until I knew your tastes and your ambitions in reading. Some of these we have read in our Patreon group, because over there we're going through our great literary adventure where together we look at, very influential books, different types of books, so that we can understand the methods of writing, whether we can understand the dispositions or the observations of great writers, and how it can all impact on us and help us to appreciate ourselves and the world we inhabit more fully. That's the whole point of my Patreon community. So if you want to get into classics and dig with a community of people, I've got my link to my Patreon down below. Why not come and pop in and have a look around to see what's going on. There's a lot of exclusive content there as well. So yes, those were the 10. Which of those have you read? Feel free to leave one or two of your own comments about books that really speak to you, that you absolutely love and would love others to at least give some consideration to them. These are not the 10 best books, by the way, before anyone says it. Yes, they are all Western. Obviously, I come from the West and my upbringing was there, so I was influenced in that regard. However, that never factors into my choice. I always see a book as written by an individual with a unique set of experiences, a unique perspective on life. I'm very much the individualist rather than the collectivist. Maybe that's why I like Robinson Crusoe. So anyway, that's my 10. Leave your comments down below and join me on Patreon if you really want to get stuck into reading the classics. Until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.